I am the margarita person. Oh, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Virtual audience, thank you very much for joining us. I'm happy to say that Phoenix has finally dipped down into a reasonable temperature. And I apologize for starting late, but we took advantage of it being so nice to have a margarita and guacamole moment and a delay in the check. So, anyway, now we're here. So, I'm delighted to have a chance to talk to you about this book because I think the location, for one thing, is truly fascinating. I love the Indian Ocean, which is not, I don't think that it's been explored all that often, has it, in the Cussler universe? I'm looking at Dirk Cussler, who was kind enough to join us this evening, and I still remember Dirk in his book that started in Nepal, and I said to him, why in the world is a Clive Cussler book starting in the Himalayas? And he said, it was a place I knew you hadn't been. So I could talk to you about it. So, Graham, come and join us since this is really your evening and your book.
Good to be here.
I've apologized to them for being late. Anyway, here we are.
Glad to be here. How are you guys doing? Oh, wait, there's the camera over there. Hold on.
Yep, it's right over.
I got to be like a newscaster.
Okay, you can do that.
There we go. I got to look at the red light. Okay.
So when I did an Instagram post today of all the display of all your beautiful books, and I wrote it was a NUMA file thing, it suddenly occurred to me that maybe there are readers who don't actually know what NUMA means. We shouldn't just assume that everyone is such a dyed-in-the-world Cussler that NUMA is like. So why don't you tell us about the National Underwater Marine Agency?
All right, I'll do my best. So while I believe that everybody does know what NUMA stands for, just in case you don't, the National Underwater Marine Agency is a creation of Clive's that he wanted an organization that could go all around the world and basically discover things, get mixed up in adventures. Obviously, he was very big into diving and underwater adventure, so that's where the underwater part comes from. And he created it fictionally for the stories that he was writing with the Dirk Pitt novels. And the interesting thing about it is he then, at least that's what I found was interesting, he then kind of turned it into a real organization because once he became successful, he wanted to go out and actually look for lost shipwrecks and various other things. And so he created his own real-life National Underwater and Marine Agency. And they would basically go search for ships, shipwrecks, and all kinds of things. And one of the things I was asked him about, because in the books, NUMA is a government agency, and it has dozens of ships and jets and helicopters and all kinds of different things like that. And then he was showing me pictures of himself and some of the other guys in the actual NUMA, and Dirk was there, I think, and they're on a little rickety boat that's like 20 feet long, and I'm like, where are all the ships? Where are the helicopters? Where are the jets? He's like, well, we don't have those yet. So, but in the books, it's a government agency that is tasked with discovering mysteries of the sea, working on, studying things that are happening underwater, how to rebuild reefs, how to deal with oil spills, how to figure out why these currents are doing this, that, or the other. And usually in the midst of some of these scientific expeditions, they end up usually uncovering something that's not really supposed to be going on. They usually uncover some kind of plot is afoot. So, and that's where the books tend to start.
Well, I mean, to be real, a thriller has to have a bad actor. It's not a thriller if there's not some antagonist there that you have to quell, so to speak. But the reason I brought it up was that I wrote a invitation yesterday, and I realized today was Veterans Day, which is also Remembrance Day and Armistice Day, although I don't know that this far away from World War I that many people really think about Armistice Day. But anyway, that made me go look, and this is a really, I'm sort of embarrassed that I actually had to look it up. What is the difference between Veterans Day and Memorial Day. You know,
You looked it up?
I did look it up, but so the difference is that Veterans Day is for everyone, living and dead, who has served in our armed forces. Memorial Day is for those people who died while serving.
That makes sense.
So I was trying to tie the book into, because tonight is Veterans Day. I was trying to tie your book into it, and then I realized that I had to make it clear that NUMA was fictional, so that we can root for them as part of Veterans Day, but we have to remember it's not real. And so I just found that, I mean, it's interesting we're doing it tonight because we're looking at basically not a fictional kind of off the books or extra armed forces operation here.
Well, and that's I mean, that's one of the things that we all love about the series, and we also all, sometimes you're working on it, and I remember when somebody told me once that this was an author that always wrote like standalone books, and he said, "Look, to me, standalone books, it's the most interesting thing that ever happened in these people's lives, and they have one big adventure, and then presumably after the adventure, they go back to their regular life or some form of that, And he said, I can't do a series because I can't imagine one person having all of these different adventures, or if it's just like a random person where it's like bad luck. Like, how much bad luck does this person have? How many people is what was the lady in Murder, She Wrote?
Oh, Jessica Fletcher.
How many people is Jessica Fletcher going to meet who die and then nobody suspects her? It's just like everybody she meets, everywhere she goes, somebody dies. But no one ever suspects Jessica Fletcher.
She unfortunately doesn't go very anywhere, so she's depopulated Cabot Cove, which is this little town that she lives in, because part of the point of a series like that is they don't actually go places most of the time.
I'm thinking of the TV show,
No.
I guess. But.
Yeah, right. But, I think there are a lot of thriller series that have kind of off the books organizations. I mean, if you think about it, Sigma Force belongs to Jim Rollins, for example. It's something he is. So what we have is like a whole bunch of agencies that are not formally of the government, but somehow or other there's financing, or there's a whole lot of like black ops operations going on. And then there's some that are actually CIA or FBI or whatever. And I think it's interesting how they differ. And NUMA has a very different, way of focusing. What's the Clancy one? What's it called? The Campus. Isn't that the name of the Clancy? Any of you read Clancy? I think it's the Campus.
I think it's one of those interesting things too, where you can play with it a lot in terms of fiction, in terms of creating the characters. And Clive definitely did more of this in the early books that he worked on before he brought us in, and the whole co-authoring thing took off, because there's in a lot of the earlier books, there's a lot of political information of what's going on behind the scenes with how NUMA's getting their money, and who, the leader of NUMA in the early days was Admiral Sandecker, and how he was connecting with, meeting up with all these, senators and other people in the government, and like, look, we need money for this and we need money for that. And I think there's even one where they needed a secret project done, and the only way to get it done was they had to somehow lose track of $600 million or something like that to build this secret underwater submarine. He said, only in Washington can you lose track of $600 million, and nobody really bats an eye. So I think Clive liked to play around with that. Like, where's the money coming from? How are they doing this? How are they building this organization? But he also was very cognizant of, and this is one of the things I think is great about NUMA that makes it different. They're not the CIA. Right. They're not a black ops organization. They're, for all intents and purposes, they're tough, regular Americans who are skilled at certain things. I think at one point he told me, when he was working on the ideas to start the NUMA Files, which was the second series in the books, he was working with Paul Komprakos, and somebody from the publishing office suggested that the new character, the Kurt Austin character, should be an ex-CIA agent or an ex-SEAL team member, and he does this, that, and the other. And Clive was like, well, he's going to be working on repairing ships and stuff, so he should be a salvage expert. He didn't want to bring in that because other guys were doing that, right? Clive's thing was always, let me see if I can find a way to do something that's different that you're not going to be getting everywhere else. And so, yeah, so he was very cognizant of making them. He's like, look, they're tough and they go on these ventures and they definitely hold their own in a big fight, but they're always out there, as some version of a regular person who might be you or me. They just happen to have these other skills that they're putting to use, and they happen to get mixed up with, fighting all these terrorists and rogue billionaires.
Rogue billionaires, right, right. So I thought that the opening scenes of this book are just wonderful in the sense that what we have are marine creatures, particularly whales, who are beached. And I thought you did such a brilliant job with Kurt working out what to do with this mammoth whale, which is asphyxiating of its own weight because there's no water, to provide enough buoyancy, and so. How did you envision that? I mean, I'm assuming you didn't actually try this yourself. So how did you work it out?
Okay, well, first of all, I appreciate that. Thank you. Second of all, it was kind of like a mental exercise. I've always thought it's interesting if you've ever studied anything to do with like marine biology, or you've watched any of these shows. We have this thing around the world where, on a somewhat random basis, at random times and places, whale or whales will just start beaching themselves, and nobody really knows why. It could be from sickness, it could be from something going wrong with their navigation system, it could be from some kind, something's happening out to sea, the ships are making too much noise or whatever. But it does kind of happen randomly. But the problem is, once these whales, they usually come in at high tide and then they get stranded, and then because their body is only designed to be supported by water all around them, they basically end up crushing themselves to where they can't actually get any air. So in the book, there's a bunch of creatures who have basically come ashore, including this one large whale. And what they're thinking is, and this is one of the things that they do think kind of happens, when it's a pod of whales, one whale comes ashore and the other whales just follow the leader, and then they get stuck there. So Kurt's thinking, if we can get this big whale off the beach, maybe the other creatures will leave. So that's the first part. So then my first thought is, how do you actually get a whale off the beach? So I looked at a lot of videos and I read a lot of stuff, and all of my first ideas were absolutely terrible and wasn't going to work. Like, well, they could just wrap a thing around his tail and tow him off the beach. Like, yeah, pretty much if you just do that, you just break all the bones in their tail and they die. So you can't just tow them off the beach. And I'm like, well, they could get a big bulldozer and push them off the beach. And it's like, well, that actually doesn't work because the whales are so heavy that basically as you're pushing them, they grind deeper and deeper into the sand and then they get stuck. So I tried to come up with, but at the same time, we don't have, usually when they do rescue one of these whales, it takes days, at least a day. They're constantly putting water on them. I'm like, I have about maybe 30 pages to do this in. So they're going to have to do this more quickly. So my big thought was, well, how do you really move anything that's heavy in the water? And I started thinking about the way that they launch ships and the way that like ships slide down into the water. And once they hit the water, they're buoyant and then they just float out. And I've always thought that was a little bit of a crazy way to even get a ship into the water in the first place. I mean, if you see the videos of that, sometimes it goes wrong. Things happen. Ships, they fall over or they don't go all just.
Aren't they on rollers?
They're on rollers,
Yeah.
but there's oftentimes something, there's enough things go wrong that there's, I'm sure, a compilation on YouTube of all the ship launchings that have gone wrong. But yeah, so my whole idea was I need to have them find a way to get this whale off the beach quickly. And what they essentially do is figure out a way to not only get enough water above the whale to push it back, but also get water under and around the whale so that instead of grinding into the sand, it's buoyant and it kind of floats back out to sea.
I thought it was a great engineering exercise. I was really impressed.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. One of the things that's great about it is, one of the reasons I wanted to do it is because one of the things I always loved in a lot of Clive's old books is he would take time to do an engineering exercise. Dirk Pitt was always building these contraptions. Like Dirk Pitt was MacGyver before MacGyver was MacGyver. He would take a bunch of things and build a contraption, and that contraption would, work and help save the day. And I'm like, this is my chance to it's not a contraption, but it's kind of a contraption, and we'll see if it works. So I appreciate the fact that you liked it, and I think it worked out pretty good.
I thought it worked out really well. And as you point out, there are other marine creatures that are also at risk. I mean, the whale's the biggest one and the most dramatic, but it's not the only one. So did you pick the Indian Ocean because of the wildlife population, so to speak, the marine and other?
Yeah, so, we're always looking for great locations, and we're much like the Himalayas. I had heard that you hadn't been to the Indian Ocean, so I thought we're always looking for great locations, and I knew this was going to have this. We're always looking for remote locations too.
Right.
Unfortunately, for the action adventure books of the world is getting smaller and smaller and smaller in terms of how quickly you can get places, or what places even exist that you won't be easily able to just pick up your phone and call for help. So we're always looking for places that you can't do that. So the further out you go, the better. But the particular thing about this location is I knew we were going to have. There's going to be a lot to do with marine biology and the wildlife here. And the island in question is called. I may not be saying this right. We would look at it and say it's called Reunion. I think the French call it La Réunion or Department of Reunion, something like that. But on the map, it'll say like Reunion Island, and it's a French island out in the Indian Ocean, and it's way, way remote. But it also happens to be this place where there, for years and years and years, was the shark attack capital of the world. And there was more shark attacks there than any other small place, to the point where they basically banned swimming and surfing, except in certain areas where they had basically put up nets so the sharks wouldn't come in. So the way the story kicks off is this whale and all these other creatures have driven themselves ashore as if something is chasing them, and nobody knows what or why. But there's another odd thing happening, and that is that Kurt and Joe have been down there looking for sharks, and they haven't been able to find any. So something is obviously going on with the ecosystem down there right off the bat, and that's basically how they end up getting into the adventure.
Right. Are there land animals also involved in this? Do I remember monkeys?
I think that was in Jack's book.
Okay.
No, I don't know. No monkeys.
Maybe
though.
no monkeys. Okay.
No monkeys.
All right. Well, anyway, although I have not actually been to Reunion, I have been to French Polynesia, to Tahiti and the other islands. And the French really run them like France. I mean, they have a certain amount of autonomy, but they provide a lot of the services, the police service, the education, the whole bit. I didn't realize that France actually had still had such a global reach, because Réunion is French. I'm trying to remember, there's a thing on TV that's called anyway, there's some islands in the South Pacific that are also still French. We have in South America, off South America, they're still French Guiana, all the rest of it.
The French, and they've definitely hung on to some places, and their culture has also permeated some of these places. I haven't been to Reunion either, but when I was doing the research, there are towns there and cities there where they're like, basically this is as close as you can get to being in like a little French village, but you're in the middle of the Indian Ocean, 15,000 miles from France.
But it's still France.
But it is France. I guess 10,000
right.
miles from France. It's proper.
Mm-hmm.
But it's probably an interesting place. The other random reason we picked that island, or I picked that island, was because it's a very populated island for the size, but it's also very mountainous. So if you imagine if this table was the island, the mountains come up right from the edge of the island, and there's really very limited land. And they got to this point where they realized they don't have enough land for their roads. So in a fairly ingenious way, around about half of the island, they decided to build a super highway on the outside of the island that runs around the island and is sitting up on 150-foot concrete pylons, but it's separated from the island by 100, 200 feet. It's basically it's a very ingenious and wild creation, and I was just like, I think that could be the site of an exciting action scene, and it basically is the action scene that is now turned into the cover here. I don't know if you can see this, but these guys are driving on a highway 200 feet off the island that is also about 200 feet up in the air while battling for survival. So we also look for good places that we can stage good action scenes.
It gives a whole new meaning to ring road, doesn't it? It actually is a ring road.
It actually is.
I know.
It actually is.
If you go to Iceland, you can circumnavigate Iceland, but the roads that you're driving on are actually on Iceland, not out in the Atlantic.
Well, and I think they would have liked to have been able to do it that way, because apparently this is also the most expensive road ever built per mile anywhere in the world. So,
okay, so if all of this is happening off Reunion, the whales and other marine creatures and all, there has to be some agency calling this. It has to be something going on that's not natural.
yes. So, Kurt and Joe begin investigating because they're surprised by all of this wildlife that's basically beached itself and washed up on the shore. And they realize something is disturbing the ecosystem around there, and something is actually, basically eating everything in the sea, little bit at a time, but whole areas of the sea suddenly see, they're looking at satellite videos and they see that there's no plankton, there's no algae, there's none of these things that are basically the lowest level of the food chain. It'd be like if you passed a satellite over the Midwest and there was no grass and there was no wheat and there was no corn and it was just dirt, and the sea appears to be going barren around this area. And they realize that these animals have been attacked by something small that has left bite marks and other things on them. So they start investigating that. And that leads to the next phase of the book, where they realize somebody is releasing something into the ocean that is growing in numbers exponentially and is threatening, all of the fish and all of the wildlife, and anything that's in the sea that's living is in danger. And so they set off to try and find out who this is and why, and what is the end game going on here.
Which we're not going to tell you. No, because that would spoil it. No, I mean, as I said before, you have to have a really good antagonist to make a really good thriller. So having solved your engineering problem and having done all that, how did you dream up the bad actors in this?
Okay, so it's always a little complicated. I think all of us authors worry that someone's gonna look at our Google search history and see, all the crazy things that we're researching, because that's how we come up with these villains. And in this particular case, I was really interested. It's funny. We decided we wanted. The book's called Desolation Code, and code can refer to a lot of things. Obviously, code is, computer code, very popular use of the word code, and we use it anytime we're building a computer program, you're coding. But code is also what we call our DNA. It's a molecular code. It's a DNA code. And the villain in this story is interested in finding a way to integrate living biological life with computer technology and computer intelligence. And there are people who believe sooner or later, some as soon as 10, 20 years, others say it'll be 100 years, but that machine intelligence and human intelligence will do what they call this thing the merge. Basically, we're all going to be connected to machines, and we're going to understand what the machine knows, and the machine is going to understand what we know, and we might all know what everybody else knows, almost like a hive mind kind of thing. And this guy is interested in taking the first step to do that. So he's manipulating genetic code in his experiments, but he is also working on building this immensely powerful machine that can experience emotions and feelings and stuff the way humans do, and he's trying to merge these two things together. And I don't know, that's a pretty good villain right there, I think. But then we had to come up with a way to make him also kind of, your villains aren't that, most villains have to be almost obsessive compulsive in what they're trying to do, because otherwise they might be like, well, I'm not going to do this today. I don't feel like being a villain today. That's not a good villain. But if you can get the villain to be, obsessed for legitimate reasons within his own, universe, you can actually create a villain who his obsession and his evil plans actually seem logical to him, and that always makes for the best villains.
Right. So, I mean, some of them, what are they after? They after money, they after power, they're after creating some, something unique to them. I mean, there's a whole variety of reasons why people do stuff like this. But you're with all the AI stuff going around, and the fact that people, they're now actually implanting chips into, isn't it for epilepsy? I think they're actually implanting chips into people's brains, to try to for good reasons. I mean, not for evil reasons. But when you said the hive mind, I think that's one of the really scary things, is that what if in fact we are, or we become a hive community, where everyone has all the same thoughts all the time, but one person can't control it. Like a beehive, really.
It'd be very. Who knows if we're going to go there? But it'd be a very strange universe if we were in a place where, we wouldn't have to have this conversation. You guys could just tap in and say, "What's Graham thinking?" Okay, nothing as usual. Mm-hmm. But if he's thinking something interesting, you could just tap into my mind, or I could tap into yours. It would make for a very strange reality that's different than our reality is based on communicating face to face, text to text, email to email, or even with like facial gestures or body postures or whatever.
Which is why a lot of artificial communication doesn't do a good job, because it does need the body, I mean, an email without any kind of body language can often be misconstrued or misinterpreted, or,
Absolutely.
I mean, it's a very poor technique, I think, for conflict resolution, because you don't get all the nuance or whatever it all is. But you know what, people, I mean, we are, as human beings, we're always driven to the next thing, I mean, and since AI is possible, I'm convinced that there are people who are going to drive us into it, as hard as they can.
I mean, it's one of those things that history would suggest that you're absolutely right. There's a lot of people who want to stop the AI revolution. And initially there was, like 2 years ago, there was a group of about 100, 200 well-known scientists, executives, computer people, philosophers who created this letter saying we should stop all AI production and research and development until we figure out how we're going to control this stuff. I mean, these are really important people like Bill Gates, even Elon Musk, all these guys who were thinking this is a technology that could easily get out of control. And there's 8 or 9, or maybe now like it might be up to 100 different organizations pursuing artificial intelligence and machine learning, trying to create machines that will just think for themselves. And the danger is eventually be able to program themselves. And they're proceeding at full speed, and there's no brakes whatsoever.
Right.
And the interesting thing is, unless you put brakes on everybody, nobody's going to slow down if the other guy's still going full speed. And so as this race continues, it is going to be strange to see what comes. In the book, we're focusing on a particular guy with a particular thought and particular mindset. In reality, there's probably 100 different dangers. In the book, the guy is, again, looking for a way to merge humanity with machines. You asked, like, what is the villain after? Yeah, I'd say he's after a kind of immortality, but also a kind of omniscient and omnipresent power. Because if he's the head of all these merged things, he's able to, like, understand, he's basically able to lead. And you talked about how there's people creating implants, and there's dozens of organizations creating computer chip implants for people's brains now, and a lot of it is going to probably help people. But there are a lot of things that help people that then can easily be turned to do harm to people. And the danger is, again, there's not a lot of regulations, not a lot of rules. And even if you did put rules on these things, the way the world works now, they would just go to some country where there are no rules. This stuff is going on full speed. I mean, we use it in a book to make it an exciting adventure and hopefully a scary story. But in reality, the reality is it's not too far from reality what we're actually putting together.
No, it's not. That's why one reason I think your book is so interesting. And you've just sort of hinted at the same thing I thought about, which is maybe this is a God complex. If this guy, we've always been kind of in pursuit of a mankind, a deity, or whatever it all is, and maybe that's what this is.
If you think about our desire for control, everything humans do, most of us, is to gain control over something. We flatten the hill to make it flat. We farm it so we can grow crops, so we don't have to hunt and gather. Then we realize we need water, so we pump in irrigation. Even from the earliest agricultural days, we're trying to get control over things, and it's in human nature to try to control everything that we can control. And yeah, that's what this character is really bent towards, and I think that's what a lot of us, to a greater or lesser degree, are bent towards in real life. So it's a little scary, yeah.
And the Indian Ocean is a great place for all this to be happening, right? So we probably can't say too much more about this. We might have actually said too much. So there we are. But it really is a super book for so many reasons. I mean, the landscape, I think, is always so important. It should be like a character in a book. And then we have our regular guys, but then we have new and terrible guys. Occasionally in this series, we get a new and wonderful guy. But I thought you hit all the bases in this book to make it a really great thriller.
Thank
And
you.
very topical as well. So, any of you have questions that you would like to ask?
And it's kind of it indirectly references the book. It's more about the industry itself, if that's okay.
Whatever you want to ask.
So I'm a writer by profession. I've written for about 25 years, but I write very unglamorous nonfiction. Grunt work, nothing pretty. And I was just wondering how fiction writers are able to use copyrighted, well, I don't want to say copyrighted, but how they're able to use real places in their novels and like real restaurants or real, you know what I'm saying? Like how you're able to do that. Is there any kind of regulation for that? I mean,
Wouldn't it be ironic if we don't regulate the most powerful technologies in the world, but we're like, writers cannot use real restaurants? And so I'm not an expert on this, but basically there's a rule called the fair use law. You can use a lot of things as long as you're not basically trying to take that and make that your own, or if you're just you're referencing it. So I suppose if you wanted to do a thing where a bunch of people got poisoned, you probably want to make up the restaurant. You don't want to use a real restaurant.
There's usually a disclaimer in the book.
I have noted, yeah, the disclaimer that none of this, it's fiction, nothing is right. I mean, you've got that.
But there are whole legal departments that worry, as James says, if you actually decide to send everybody to dinner at a restaurant and they all die of, whatever it is. So if you're going to do something terrible, chances are you should make it up. But
Yeah.
if you're going to do something that's good, then I have a story.
That was a
here-
good
all right,
point.
I have a great story here to illustrate this point. So there was a Robert Parker last year, which all take place in Boston, right? And I think it was a Spencer, but I can't remember which character it was. Probably Spencer. Anyway, as part of the story, they had dinner in a restaurant in Boston, and the author extolled it. It looks out over not the Boston Common, but some other park, and the chef is amazing, and it just sounded wonderful. And I realized that I was about to go to Boston to see the John Singer Sargent show, and I thought, I wonder if this is a real restaurant. So I got out my phone and I looked it up, and amazingly, it was a real restaurant. So then I tried using Open Table to make a reservation for my friend and myself to eat dinner there, and Open Table said no, they were sorry, it was booked till like February or something like that. So I was briefly
It's Robert Parker's
discouraged.
fault.
I was briefly discouraged, but then I thought that seems really so. I called them, and in fact, they were thrilled, and they said, "Why, you know?" And anyway, I told them that they were featured in a book, and it sounded so wonderful. That's why I wanted to come for dinner. So we made a date. So I arrive at the restaurant with my friend Dana, having had a long day at the Museum of Fine Arts. The owner is there. They take us up. They give us a window table. The chef cooks our own dinner for us. They complimented the wine. You know, I mean, it was they were so excited that they had been in this book. So when I got home, we had one signed copy left of the book. So I packaged it up with a little thank you note and wrapped it up and all and sent it to the restaurant where they tell me they have it on display. So my point is that if you do a good thing with a real place, they will usually be happy. But on the other hand, if Spencer had arrived to find a body, you know, submerged in the hot fat in the kitchen or something and completely dead, then it would have been a whole different story, right? So a lot of times authors over the years have said that if they use a real place, they almost always get emails from people who say, there really wasn't a stop sign at that intersection or whatever. So Google Maps probably makes it easier. Dan Brown, you know, came under a lot of fire with the Da Vinci Code because he did not have a three-dimensional view of Paris. And so there's some scene where something happens and he had the streets and everything right, but the problem was that the building was so tall you couldn't actually see over it to do whatever was going on. So you have to be careful if you're using real places.
You do. And I think
to be accurate.
I think we've probably all fallen into that trap. In my first book, there's a scene. The book's called Black Rain, and it's different characters. It was a book that I wrote before I started working with Clive. But there's a scene where a guy gets pushed off the edge of a bridge in Washington, D.C. And I've been on this bridge. I've driven over this bridge. I was looking at tons of pictures of this bridge, and I was like, this will be great. He gets pushed off this bridge, and he falls into the Potomac, and, you know, we think he's gone. And I have the guy just pushing him up on the railing and then shoving him over. And I thought, you know, great. That's great. It works out perfectly. Well, the year the book came out, my girlfriend and I went out to Washington, and I said, I want to go see this bridge. I got to check out this bridge because I want to show you the scenes where it happened. And we get there, and what looks in a photograph like a railing like this high is actually about this high. And I'm like, that did not look like that when I was looking it up on Google or whatever. And I'm like, he would have to be really strong to push the guy up here and then push him over. But it happens. I mean,
probably needed a crane on the back of his car or something to accomplish it.
Yeah, I mean, it happens. You think you've got something nailed down, and it is usually someone will email you and be like, you know, that bridge, that the railing is 6 feet high. Just didn't look like that on the picture.
So you have to be careful if literary characters have been copyrighted. You can't, you have to look at that. You can't introduce song lyrics or poetry without permission. There's, what is it, like 3 lines under fair use or something, but so there are lots of authors who think, they can have like the header of the chapter be a verse from Bob Dylan or something. It doesn't work that way. But I think otherwise, I don't think there are really rules. I think you just have to use common sense and then have the legal department check it out, and you have to be careful not to, I don't know, there's a whole public figure exemption too. So maybe you can actually pretend that a real character is doing something bad, but you want to be careful they're not going to come after you.
Yeah. I just make them all up.
If they're dead,
you might as well. You're
Right.
probably easier off just making anything up that you don't particularly. If for some reason you want to use something, it's also a lot of times you can just call people up and get permission. I don't know. I just make stuff up. I don't like to pick up the phone and actually talk to people, so I'm like, I'm just going to make a restaurant up here.
There is a feature in Google Maps where you can have it measure a distance. I want to try
Google Maps didn't exist when I wrote my first book. In fact, another funny story about writing a book is you have to be careful about how fast technology progresses. A lot of authors, you spend years on your first book. And I spent roughly 7 years working on my first book before it went out to an agent and got picked up and then got published. But when I started writing the book, people were using floppy disks. And by the time I was sending it out to agents and stuff, the characters were still using floppy disks, but they were like, we don't use that. We use CD-ROM now. And I was like, oh, okay. So I put CD-ROM in there. And then by the time it got published, it was like, we just use hard drives now. I'm like, this damn technology, it's causing all kinds of problems.
No, that's really true. Somebody once said to me that if you're writing a book where money is involved, I think it was a book about golf or something, that you had to be very careful, like not to quote the size of the purse, that the winner would get, because it will age the book, because, so there's just all kinds of tricks that, depending on what you're writing. What are your books about?
Oh, I don't write books. I write for, I'm semi-retired now, but I wrote for computer magazines.
Ah.
And research database for universities and libraries. So like stuff.
So you're going to send me a letter saying none of the technology in this book makes any sense, right?
Absolutely, will definitely do that.
All right, I appreciate it. I'll look for it.
But yeah, no books, just really grunt work like indexing and abstracts. But it was pretty lucrative. Most people when they think about authors, they think about what you do. But most of us are like, we do the unglamorous grunt work, which is fun.
I was just going to say, if you're saying it's lucrative, I know some people who might want to talk to you. Well, I'll talk to you after the show.
Paid the bills.
So anybody else have a question? That was an excellent one. Thank you very much for asking that. Yes, sir.
I have a question about when you're working in someone else's universe. Is there like some guides that you have to follow? How much interaction do you have in what you can and can't do, and what you can make up, and what has to fit inside the universe?
So I assume you mean by like a universe, like I'm working in the NUMA universe, but I didn't create that universe. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely.
You have to respect what went before.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of these legacy books, they'll create what they call a Bible, which has all the stuff you need to know. With Clive, he was honestly way more freewheeling about what you could do, because he kind of considered each book part of the universe, but almost like its own thing. So if you needed to do something that was different than what he did 5 books ago, he was okay with that. But for the characters and their motivations and their reality, there was kind of like an ironclad, like this is how they are, this is how the character is, So you're always cognizant of that. You are like, you have less freedom than being your own author, but you find freedom other ways, and you know what you're getting into. You usually don't take a job like this unless you really like this kind of writing anyways in the first place. So it's usually like a thrill. It's like your friend is going to loan you his Ferrari, and he says, now here are the things that I don't want you to do. You're not going to be like, never mind, I'll just take the Pinto. You're going to go take the Ferrari, and you're just going to drive it carefully and do what you're supposed to do. So
Yeah, but people who write long series of their own can get trapped in the series. I remember years ago, I think it was Laurie King, was maybe her second or third book, but somebody asked her a question about her first book, and she said, here's the thing, when you write a first book, it's like you pack a trunk and you put stuff into it. Some of it you might never use, some of it, but you can't suddenly make somebody, you can't give them a complete makeover. So any series has guardrails that stem from the first book, wherever that character is. That's why a lot of authors write prequels for a long series, because you picked a moment in time for that character to start. They were X age and they were, in certain place or whatever. And you don't know when you're starting out the series what you know some of their previous history, but you might not know a lot of it. My favorite was Charles Finch, who started out to write. He writes a wonderful Victorian mystery series, and at some point he decided he would write a prequel, and then it turned into a trilogy, because he got so interested in the prequel that he thought he needed another and then another one, and it was really fun because you knew where the characters were when you first met them and how they had progressed, but then it was really fun for you as a reader. He was like 10 or 12 books in. I mean, it wasn't, to go back and see how things had happened. I loved it. I thought it was a brilliant thing to do.
I actually think when you get into a universe kind of situation, Marvel Universe, NUMA Universe, Bond Universe, the one you're talking about, you get to the fans who are really into it, who want to explore the other parts of the universe that are not right there, front and center. I always used to wonder, a big Star Trek fan, sometimes they'd have a scene where they're like on a base somewhere and they go down and there's some guy that's working there. He's probably lowest level Starfleet employee and he's working on the transporter late at night. No one else is there and he has to beam something to the Enterprise. And I'm always like, I wonder what that guy's life is like, right? Like, let's do a story about him Dirk and I were actually talking earlier about like what kind of things go on at NUMA headquarters when they're not out there having these life, changing adventures. And as writers, you have to do this stuff because it's fun, but it also triggers some ideas sometimes. But we were just joking. We're like, yeah, I mean, what if it's just an office day and like Kurt
Who's
and
making
Joe,
coffee?
yeah, who's making coffee? And then Dirk was like, yeah, the big event is like, yeah, paper cut. It's just like, this is the big event going on today because we're not having to save the world. Like, there's got to be some days when they're just in the office doing paperwork, right? Most people don't want to read that, but there's a couple of fans out there to be like, I think it'd be curious to see what an office day at NUMA is like. Who wants office day at NUMA? All right.
Excellent point. I do know from talking to some authors who have written books that stem from movies that the guardrails are much tighter. Michael Stackpole, who lives here, wrote a number of the Star Trek, and you could not vary, because the movie franchise was still out there. So that was a much more rigorous, and they insisted on reading it, to make sure that, so that, Clive was never like that. And most of the franchises, for example, Spencer still had to be Spencer, even though, we're way out here. Hawk, hasn't turned into a Chinese guy or, Spencer. I mean, let's face it, Spencer went from being a Korean War veteran to a Vietnam veteran to a Gulf War veteran to a sort of undisclosed whatever it is. So even there, but he still had to be Spencer, so I think you can, even in your own universe, you still have guardrails.
Absolutely. Even writing for yourself, you always put some kind of guardrails up. And then there are other guardrails that pop up. I remember in one of the James Bond movies, suddenly he was driving a BMW, and all of us were like, well, that doesn't make sense. That's not right. Like, I know BMW paid $10 million to put this car in the movie, but I don't think that's right. That's not working for me. So there are things that as fans you want to see, in the Dirk Pitt books, they always want to see him driving an amazing old car. If he just never finds a car in the Dirk Pitt book, I'm sure people are going to be disappointed. It's just, there are things we latch onto as fans that we want to see, and I think those are a kind of guardrail of their own. But you can have fun with it. But it's like, okay, this is one of the touchstones of this book. We got to find a way to get it in there.
Very true. Anybody else? No? Well, all right. Then, sorry, one more question. Okay.
It's kind of another tangent. Okay. That's all right. I don't get an opportunity to talk to fiction writers very often.
Don't feel bad. I'm just glad somebody's asking questions. The rest of you are going to have talking to later.
So what I used to do, I had to do a lot of research, and I had to make sure that my sources were peer-reviewed studies and in these like medical journals or whatever. I had to be so careful to make sure that my sources were accurate. And this is, writing for a research database. It was EBSCOhost. I don't know if you know it. But anyway, I was just wondering how that is for you. Like, when you do your research, is there a site you look at? Because I know like Wikipedia is peer, what do you call it? I just lost the word. But anybody can submit articles to Wikipedia. So there's not that rigorous standard of fact. You know what I mean?
It's like Google searches. I mean, you know, people believe that the stuff that comes up first is the best stuff, and you know, usually it's the paid stuff.
Usually it's, yeah,
Right, 'cause
exactly.
it would be really hard to find good sources online. And I was just wondering if that was something you've encountered when you write.
I mean, of course, but it's also, you know, it's you no, but you know, we all have our detectors like this doesn't sound right, this does, and you don't just rely on one source. If you're looking up something that's important for your story, you're gonna go through multiple layers to make sure that you understand what you're doing. And then again, as a fiction author, you know, if you can't find the thing you want, you can just invent it. I mean, it's fiction. You know, there is, you know, there is no Hogwarts, but if you want there to be, you can make one up, right? So
But there are novels that do have footnotes. You know, The Name of the Rose is a real classic. It was my third time tackling that book when I finally was able to read it because I got so lost in the footnotes and the Latin that I completely forgot the story. And finally, I resolved that I was going to totally ignore everything but the actual story and read it. But there are a lot of novels that do have, you know, especially historical fiction. And you know, they don't have indexes as a rule, but they very often have footnotes. And a danger for historical fiction writers is to include too much of their research and bog down the story. That's so that's a big if you're working in a real world. So often in historical fiction, you have real life characters whose lives you can't completely distort, and then your protagonist or whatever will be somebody you made up. But you know, we have Jane Austen characters now being sleuths, so they've taken on like a real Emma Knightley is now, you know, a sleuth. So fiction characters become real, and then they take on. I know it's really fascinating how it all works. I love it.
I mean, the whole idea of reinventing older characters for these different kind of things, I find that to be really interesting too. It gives you a different take on, and it brings these things to life for people who would have otherwise never even read them. So it's kind of cool.
Very much so. I agree. All right. Is that the last one? Well, thank you very much then. Thank you for your attention, for your questions. Virtual audience, thank you for joining us. If you would like to talk to Graham or get your book signed, then he's going to stay right here. I'll get him a pen, and you can do that. So,
Thanks, everybody.